wind tore through the trees like it wanted to rip them from the ground, and Elena Whitmore was already running before she understood why. Her boots sank into wet snow, her breath came out in sharp white clouds, and somewhere ahead of her, past the black wall of pines, something was crying. It was not the cry of a bird or a fox. It was smaller than that, and more desperate, a thin, broken sound that made her chest tighten before her mind had even caught up to her feet. She had left her cabin without a coat. She had left without her flashlight. She had left the moment she heard the first cry carry through her open window, and now the storm was closing around her like a fist, and she still had not stopped moving. The ravine came up faster than she expected. 1 second there was solid ground beneath her, and the next, there was a steep drop lined with broken rock and frozen brush, and at the bottom of it, half buried in snow, something was moving. She did not think. She grabbed the nearest tree root and lowered herself down, ignoring the way the ice cut into her palms, ignoring the way her ankle twisted awkwardly against a stone. At the bottom of the ravine, curled against a fallen log, was a wolf cub. It could not have been more than a few weeks old. Its fur was matted with snow, its small body trembling so hard that Elena could see the shivers from 3 feet away. Its eyes were barely open, and when it saw her, it did not run. It could not run. It only whimpered, and the sound was so raw and so small that something inside Elena simply broke open. She should not have gone near it. Every rule she had ever learned about wild animals told her to leave it, to call someone, to let nature take its course, even when nature was cruel. But there was no one to call out here, not in this storm, not at this hour, and the cub would be dead within minutes if she did nothing. She pulled off her sweater and wrapped it around the shaking little body, and the moment she lifted the cub against her chest, she felt its heartbeat, fast and frightened, pressed against her own. It was warm in a way that surprised her, warmer than it should have been for something so small and so cold, but she had no time to wonder about that. The storm was getting worse, and the climb back up the ravine would not be easy. It took her almost 20 minutes to get back to her cabin, carrying the cub the entire way, her twisted ankle screaming with every step. By the time she pushed through her front door, her fingers had gone numb, and her lips had turned pale, but the cub was still breathing, and that was the only thing that mattered. She spent the rest of the night in front of the fireplace, holding the cub close, rubbing warmth back into its small limbs, feeding it drops of warm milk from an old dropper she had used years ago for injured birds. She did not sleep. She could not. Every time the cub's breathing slowed, panic rose in her throat, and every time it steadied again, relief nearly brought her to tears. By morning, the storm had passed, and the cub was alive. Its eyes, when they opened fully for the first time, were a strange pale gold, almost silver in certain light, and there was something about the way it looked at her that felt less like an animal recognizing a caretaker, and more like it was studying her, weighing her, deciding something about her. She told herself she was imagining things. She had been awake for over 20 hours. Her mind was playing tricks. She named him Shadow, because his fur was so dark it seemed to swallow the morning light, and because he had appeared out of nowhere, the way shadows do, without warning and without explanation. Elena had lived at the edge of Wolfsbane Ridge for almost 4 years. She ran a small wildlife rescue from her cabin, patching up injured foxes, owls, the occasional deer caught in a fence. She was used to solitude. She was used to the forest's strange sounds at night, the way the trees seemed to lean in closer during a storm, the way the locals in the nearest town spoke about the ridge in careful, clipped sentences, as though naming it too loudly might draw its attention. She had heard the stories, of course. Everyone who lived near Wolfsbane Ridge had. Hunters spoke of wolves that moved like they were thinking, wolves that seemed to vanish the moment a rifle was raised, wolves that never, ever came near the town unless something had gone terribly wrong. There were old warnings passed down through generations, warnings that made no sense in daylight, but felt entirely reasonable at 3 in the morning, when the wind howled just a little too much like a voice. Elena had never taken the stories seriously. She loved animals, and she had spent her whole life being told to fear the very creatures she felt safest around. She assumed the warnings were exaggeration, folklore built up over decades of isolated winters, and too much imagination. They were dangerous in the way any wild animal was dangerous, nothing more. But even she had to admit, as she looked down at the cub sleeping in a nest of blankets by her fire, that something about him felt different. He did not smell quite like the foxes or coyotes she had cared for before. His eyes tracked her movements with an intelligence that unsettled her, just slightly, in a way she could not name, and there was warmth radiating from his small body that had nothing to do with fever. She pushed the thought aside. She had a job to do. The cub was malnourished, dehydrated, and clearly separated from his mother far too early. Whatever had happened to him in that ravine, whatever storm or accident had left him abandoned in the snow, her only responsibility now was to help him survive it. Over the next 2 days, Shadow grew stronger, with startling speed. By the second morning, he was already trying to stand on wobbly legs. By the second night, he had found his way into her lap, without invitation, curling against her stomach, with a confidence that felt almost human. She laughed at herself for thinking that, but the feeling would not leave her. She did not know, could not have known, that less than 3 miles away, in the deep, hidden heart of Wolfsbane Ridge, an entire pack had gone silent with grief and fury. She did not know that hunters and trackers far more dangerous than any wolf she had imagined were combing the forest for a missing heir, moving with a purpose and a discipline that no ordinary animal possessed. She did not know that the cub sleeping peacefully against her chest was the son of a creature the locals whispered about only in their most careful moments, a leader so feared and so powerful that even the boldest hunters refused to set foot past a certain line in the trees. All Elena knew was that a small, frightened animal had needed help, and she had given it without hesitation. She did not think about the cost of that choice. She did not think about the danger she might have wandered into simply by lifting a shivering cub out of the snow. On the third day, she noticed something odd. Every evening, just after sunset, a strange stillness settled over the woods surrounding her cabin. The birds stopped calling. The wind seemed to hold its breath. And in that stillness, she often felt as though she were being watched, though whenever she looked toward the tree line, there was nothing there but shadows and snow. She told herself it was nerves. She told herself that anyone living this close to the forest would eventually start imagining eyes in the darkness. But the feeling grew stronger each night, not weaker, and by the fourth evening, she found herself standing at her window long after she should have gone to bed, staring into the trees, with a strange, tight feeling in her chest that she could not explain. She did not see the pale eyes watching her from the tree line that night. She did not see the 2 scouts crouched low in the brush, studying the warm glow of her cabin windows, watching the small shape of the cub moving behind the glass. She did not hear the low, careful conversation carried between them, in a language no human ear could interpret as anything more than the wind. She only knew that when she finally went to bed that night, Shadow curled tightly against her side. She slept more soundly than she had in weeks, comforted by the small, warm body beside her, unaware that somewhere out in the darkness, the search for him had already begun, and that it would not end quietly. By the end of the first week, Elena had grown deeply attached to the cub, more attached than she had ever allowed herself to become with any animal she had rescued before. She told herself it was simply because he had needed her so desperately, because she had saved his life with her own hands, in the middle of a storm that could have easily taken hers as well. But there was something else there too, something she could not quite name, a pull she felt whenever those pale gold eyes settled on her face. She began keeping a small journal about his recovery, noting his appetite, his growing strength, the way he had started following her from room to room like a small dark shadow of her own. She noted, almost as an afterthought, how unusually intelligent he seemed for his age, how he seemed to understand simple words like stay and come, far faster than any wolf pup should. She wrote it off as an anomaly. She had no reason yet to think otherwise. What she did not write down, because she barely let herself think it, was the growing sense that she was not simply caring for an abandoned animal. She was holding on to something that belonged to someone else, something powerful and important enough that its absence had already set forces into motion that she could not see and did not yet understand. On the 7th night, as she carried Shadow to his blanket by the fire, she paused at the window one more time. The forest beyond her cabin was utterly still, the kind of silence that felt less like peace and more like a held breath before a storm. She stood there a long moment, feeling the weight of unseen eyes pressing against the glass, and for the first time since she had pulled the cub from the ravine, a small thread of fear coiled tight in her stomach. She did not know it yet, but that fear was the only sensible thing she had felt in 7 days. Because far beyond the tree line, deep in the heart of Wolfsbane Ridge, The Alpha King had just received word of where his missing son had been found, and he was already moving through the dark toward her cabin, with a fury that no warning sign in the world could have prepared her for. Cain had not slept in 3 days. He did not need much sleep under ordinary circumstances, but these were not ordinary circumstances, and every hour that passed without his son felt like a blade dragged slowly across his chest. He stood at the edge of the northern clearing, his pale eyes fixed on the horizon, his jaw tight enough to ache, while around him the pack moved in careful, anxious silence. No one spoke unless spoken to. No one met his gaze directly. That was not fear exactly, though fear was part of it. It was respect, the kind earned through years of steady leadership, and it was also caution, because everyone in the pack understood that a father searching for a missing child was far more dangerous than any alpha defending his territory. Dorian, his second in command, approached carefully, his head lowered slightly out of habit rather than command. He had known Cain since they were young, had fought beside him through more than one difficult winter, and he was one of the few in the pack who could speak to him plainly, without fear of consequence. The scouts found tracks near the ravine, Dorian said. Small tracks. His tracks. They lead toward the human dwelling at the edge of the ridge. Cain's whole body went rigid. A human took him. We do not know that yet, Dorian said carefully. The tracks near the ravine end abruptly. There was a storm that night. It is possible he was carried, not taken. Carried by what? Dorian hesitated, and that hesitation told Cain everything he needed to know. There was only one dwelling near that ravine, a small cabin that had sat quietly at the edge of their territory for years, occupied by a lone woman who kept to herself and had never once caused trouble for the pack. They had watched her from a distance out of habit more than concern, noting her comings and goings, her strange fondness for injured creatures she nursed back to health before releasing them into the wild. Cain had never given her much thought before. She was simply part of the landscape, harmless, predictable, unimportant. But now his son's tracks led directly toward her cabin, and every instinct in his body screamed that something had gone terribly wrong. "Take me there," Cain said, and his voice left no room for argument. They moved through the forest in near silence, a formation of 6 wolves cutting through the trees, with a speed and precision that no ordinary pack could match. Cain ran at the front, his mind consumed by every possible outcome, none of them good. Humans feared wolves. Humans hunted wolves. If his son had been taken by a hunter rather than rescued by an act of chance, there would be nothing left of Wolfsbane Ridge's careful peace with the nearby town by the time Cain was finished. He tried not to think about worse possibilities. He tried not to think about his son cold and alone in a trap, or worse, not breathing at all. He had lost too much already in his life to lose this too, and the thought alone was enough to make his claws lengthen involuntarily, sharp and ready, long before they reached the cabin. When they finally came within sight of it, crouched low in the tree line just as the sun was beginning to set, Cain forced himself to stop and observe rather than charge forward blindly. That control, more than any other trait, was what had made him a leader worth following. Rage without discipline was simply another way to fail. The cabin looked unremarkable from the outside. Smoke curled gently from its chimney. A single light glowed warm behind curtained windows. There was nothing about it that suggested danger, nothing that suggested cruelty. And yet Cain's chest tightened painfully as he caught, faint but unmistakable, the scent of his son carried on the evening air. He was here, he was close, and he was, as far as Cain's senses could tell, alive. That single fact kept Cain from crashing through the front door in that moment. Instead, he watched. Night after night, he and his scouts kept careful distance from the cabin, observing without being seen, gathering information before acting. It was Dorian, watching through the frost-covered window on the second night, who first reported something that made Cain's fury falter into confusion. "The cub is not caged," Dorian said quietly, when they had retreated far enough into the trees to speak without risk of being overheard. "He is by the fire, wrapped in blankets. The woman fed him from her own hand." Cain said nothing, but something in his expression shifted, the rigid fury cracking just slightly to let something else through. "He looks healthy," Dorian continued. "Healthier, perhaps, than when he was lost." It made no sense to Cain. Humans did not care for wolves. Humans feared them, avoided them, sometimes hunted them for sport, or fear, or misguided pride. And yet here was a lone woman, living quietly at the edge of his territory, who had apparently taken his abandoned son into her home and nursed him back from what could easily have been death. He told himself it did not matter. A human hand on his son's fur, whatever the intention, was unacceptable. He told himself that gratitude was a weakness he could not afford, not when the safety of his pack and his bloodline was at stake. And yet as the days passed, and his scouts continued to report the same thing night after night, a small, uncomfortable seed of doubt began to grow in him. By the fifth night of watching, Cain could stand the distance no longer. Every hour spent observing from the trees was another hour his son spent in a stranger's care, and no amount of careful strategy could quiet the ache of that separation. He made his decision at dusk, as the last light faded from the sky, and the cabin's windows began to glow warm against the darkness. He would go alone. Whatever this woman was, whatever her intentions, he needed to see for himself, needed to stand in front of her, and understand exactly what kind of creature had taken his son into her home. If she meant harm, if there was any sign of cruelty hidden beneath the surface of gentle care his scouts described, he would end it swiftly and without hesitation. He moved through the trees like a shadow given purpose, silent despite his size, his massive frame built for speed and force in equal measure. As he neared the edge of the clearing surrounding the cabin, he shifted from his four-legged form into the shape he rarely used, except among his own kind, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in the simple dark clothing his people wore when moving among the human world. It was easier this way, he told himself. Easier to speak, easier to demand answers, easier to control the fury still burning hot beneath his ribs. He reached the front door, just as the last of the evening light disappeared behind the ridge. Through the window, he could see her clearly for the first time, not from a hidden distance but up close, close enough to see the exhaustion in her posture, the gentle care in the way she moved around the small space. The cub curled contentedly near the fire, exactly where Dorian had described. She had not noticed him yet. She was humming softly to herself as she prepared something at the stove, unaware that the most dangerous creature in Wolfsbane Ridge stood only a few feet from her door, his hand raised, hesitating for just a moment, before he finally knocked. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the quiet evening. Inside, he heard her movement stop abruptly. He heard her footsteps approach the door slowly, cautiously, the way anyone living alone in an isolated cabin would approach an unexpected knock after dark. When the door finally opened, and Elena Whitmore found herself face to face with a tall stranger whose pale gold eyes seemed to see straight through her, Cain felt something in his chest shift again, sharper this time, more unsettling. Because standing there in the doorway, illuminated by the firelight behind her, she showed no fear at all. Only confusion, and behind that, unmistakably, concern. As though she was more worried about him standing out in the cold than afraid of what he might be. It was not the reaction he had expected. It was not a reaction he knew how to answer. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice steady, despite the late hour and the unfamiliar face at her door. Behind her, the cub lifted his head from the blankets, and the moment his pale gold eyes landed on Cain, a small, excited sound escaped him, one that needed no translation at all. Cain's fury, so carefully built over 5 long days of searching and waiting, cracked entirely in that instant, replaced by something far more complicated, something he was not at all prepared to feel, toward a human, standing quietly in her own doorway, offering warmth to a stranger, without a single thought for her own safety. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. Elena studied the stranger standing on her porch, taking in his height, the strange stillness in the way he held himself, the pale gold color of his eyes, that seemed almost impossible in the dim evening light. Something about him felt wrong, in a way she could not quite name. Not dangerous exactly, but unfamiliar, like meeting someone who did not belong to the same world she lived in. "I am looking for something that belongs to me," Cain said finally, his voice low and controlled, though every word cost him effort. "I believe you have him." Elena's hand tightened instinctively on the doorframe. Her mind raced through possibilities, none of them comfortable. Had someone seen her carrying the cub back from the ravine? Was this man a hunter, come to claim an animal he believed was his property, perhaps a pet that had escaped, or worse, an animal he intended to use for something cruel? "I don't know what you're talking about," she said carefully. though her eyes flicked involuntarily toward the fireplace behind her, where Shadow had lifted his head and was watching the stranger with an intensity that made her stomach tighten. Kane followed her gaze, and whatever composure he had been holding on to cracked entirely at the sight of the cub. He took a step forward without meaning to, and Elena's body moved instinctively to block the doorway, small and unarmed against a man who towered over her, but resolute all the same. "He is not yours to take," Kane said, his voice sharper now, edged with a warning that made the air between them feel suddenly heavier. "He was dying in a ravine," Elena said, refusing to step aside. "Half frozen, abandoned, crying so loud I heard it from inside my own house during a storm. I don't know who you are or what claim you think you have, but I am not handing over an animal I nursed back from the edge of death to a stranger who shows up on my porch after dark demanding things." It was not bravery exactly, though it looked like it from the outside. It was simply the truth of who she was, someone incapable of standing by while something innocent suffered, whether that suffering came from a storm or from a man's impatience. Kane stared at her, something shifting behind his pale eyes, a recalculation happening in real time that Elena could not have understood, even if she had noticed it. "You went into the ravine," he said slowly, as though testing the words for truth. "During the storm." "Yes. Alone." "There was no one else out here to help him," Elena said. "So yes, alone." Kane's jaw worked silently for a moment. He had expected, if he was honest with himself, to find neglect or cruelty behind that door, evidence that would justify the fury still simmering beneath his controlled exterior. He had not expected to find a woman willing to climb into a frozen ravine during a violent storm, for a creature she had never seen before and owed nothing to. "He is my son," Kane said finally, and the words seemed to cost him something, an admission he had not planned to make so plainly to a stranger. Elena's expression shifted from confusion to something closer to disbelief. "Your son," she repeated slowly. "He's a wolf." "Yes," Kane said, and left it at that, watching her carefully to see how she would respond to the strange, incomplete truth he had offered. For a moment, Elena simply stared at him, searching his face for some sign that this was a joke, or a misunderstanding, or the ramblings of someone unwell. But there was nothing in his expression that suggested any of those things. There was only a fierce, exhausted kind of worry that she recognized instantly, the same worry she had felt herself while carrying the cub back through the storm. "Come inside," she said finally, stepping back from the doorway, though every instinct told her this decision made no logical sense at all. "It's cold, and whatever is going on here, we're not going to sort it out on my porch." Kane hesitated, surprised by the invitation, before stepping through the door into the warmth of the small cabin. The moment he crossed the threshold, the cub let out an excited sound and scrambled unsteadily off his blanket, half tumbling across the floor in his eagerness to reach him. Kane knelt immediately, gathering the small trembling body against his chest, and for the first time since the search had begun, something in his shoulders finally loosened. Elena watched the reunion from a careful distance, her arms crossed, her mind working through everything that had just happened. Whatever this man was, whatever strange claim he had to the cub she had spent a week nursing back to health, the bond between them was undeniable. The cub pressed against him with total trust, nuzzling against his neck, making small, contented sounds that Elena had never heard him make before, not even with her. "He's been healthy," she said finally, breaking the silence. "Eating well, gaining strength every day. I was going to look for a way to release him once he was old enough." "Release him where?" Kane asked, his voice quieter now, though his eyes remained sharp and watchful. "Back into the wild, I suppose," Elena said. "Wherever wolves go around here." Something almost like amusement flickered across Kane's face, though it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "He is not simply a wolf," he said carefully. "And this is not simply wilderness. You live at the edge of territory that belongs to my people, territory we have protected for generations. You should understand that before anything else is explained to you." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. "Your people," she repeated. Kane studied her for a long moment, weighing something behind his pale eyes, some decision Elena could not begin to guess at. Finally, he spoke again, his voice low and deliberate. "There is more to what you rescued than you understand, more to what lives in these woods than most humans ever learn. And for good reason. I am not yet certain how much you deserve to know, given what you have done for my son. But know this, you have stepped into something far larger than an act of kindness toward an injured animal. Elena's mind raced through the implications of his words, though she could not yet grasp their full shape. She thought of the strange stillness she had felt each evening at her window, the sense of being watched that she had dismissed as nerves. She thought of how quickly the cub had grown, how unnaturally intelligent he seemed, how warm his small body had felt against hers, in a way that defied ordinary biology. "What are you?" she asked finally, her voice quieter now, though still steady. Cain held her gaze for a long moment before answering. "Something you are not prepared to understand tonight," he said. "But something that owes you a debt regardless, whether either of us is comfortable with that fact or not." He rose to his feet then, the cub cradled carefully against him, and for a moment, Elena feared he intended to simply leave, taking the small creature she had grown so attached to without another word. But instead, he set the cub gently back down onto the blanket by the fire, watching as it curled contentedly, clearly reluctant to leave despite whatever urgency had brought him here in the first place. "He will stay with you a while longer," Cain said finally, surprising her. "He is not yet strong enough to return to the pack, and you have clearly cared for him well. But understand that this arrangement comes with conditions, and that I will be watching closely to ensure those conditions are respected." Elena opened her mouth to argue, some instinct rising in her at the idea of a stranger dictating terms in her own home, but something in Cain's expression stopped her. Whatever this man was, whatever strange world he belonged to, the exhaustion and fear she had seen in his face when he first appeared at her door had been entirely real. Whatever pride or authority he carried, it had clearly been shaken badly over the past several days. "Fine," she said finally. "Conditions." Cain nodded once, satisfied, though something in his gaze lingered on her a moment longer than necessary before he turned toward the door. "I will return tomorrow evening," he said. "There is much you need to understand, and very little time in which to explain it safely." He left as quietly as he had arrived, disappearing into the darkness beyond her porch light, leaving Elena standing alone in her small cabin, with a sleeping cub by the fire, and 1,000 unanswered questions crowding her mind. She did not sleep well that night, though this time, it was not fear that kept her awake, but the strange, unsettling certainty that her quiet, solitary life had just changed, in ways she could not yet begin to understand. Cain returned the following evening exactly as he had promised, arriving just as the last light faded behind the ridge. This time Elena was watching for him, standing at her window with a cup of tea growing cold in her hands, her mind still turning over everything that had happened the night before. When his tall figure emerged from the tree line, she found herself oddly relieved rather than afraid, though she could not have explained why. She opened the door before he could knock, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other, two people from entirely different worlds trying to find some common footing between them. Behind her, Shadow had already caught his father's scent, and his excited scrambling toward the door broke whatever tension had settled over the doorway. "Come in," Elena said, stepping aside. "I made tea. I don't know if that's something you drink, but I made it anyway." Something flickered across Cain's face, an expression close to surprise, as though the ordinary gesture had caught him off guard. "Tea will be fine," he said, and followed her inside. They sat across from each other at her small kitchen table, while the cub played contentedly near the fire, chasing a bit of loose yarn Elena had given him days earlier. Cain wrapped his hands around the warm cup she offered, but did not drink from it right away, studying her instead, with the same careful, assessing gaze he had used the night before. "You asked what I am," he said finally. "I intend to answer that, but I need you to listen without interrupting until I have finished. What I am about to tell you will sound impossible. It is not." Elena nodded slowly, setting her own cup down, giving him her full attention. "My people are not entirely human, and not entirely wolf," Cain began. "We are both, depending on need and circumstance. We have lived in these woods for longer than any town nearby has existed, hidden from human knowledge, not out of malice, but out of necessity. Discovery has never gone well for creatures like us throughout history, and so we have learned to remain unseen, to blend into the forest as easily as we blend into human towns when required." Elena's mind worked quickly through the implications of what he was describing, matching it against every strange detail she had noticed since finding the cub. The unnatural warmth of his small body, the rapid healing, the intelligence in his eyes that seemed far too advanced for an ordinary wolf pup. It should have sounded impossible, the kind of story reserved for children's tales or late-night campfire warnings. But sitting across from this man, watching the utter seriousness in his expression, she found she believed him without a single shred of doubt. "He shifts," she said quietly, looking toward the cub by the fire. "Like you." "When he is older, yes," Kane said. "Right now he is simply a cub, too young to control the change safely. But the potential is there, as it is in every child born to my people." "And you?" Elena said carefully. "What are you? Exactly. Within your own people. You said territory. You said pack. That suggests some kind of structure." Kane's expression grew more guarded, though he did not look away from her. "I lead them," he said simply. "All of them. Every pack within these woods answers to me, and every decision that affects our people passes through my judgment. My son is not simply my child. He is heir to that leadership, and his loss would have destabilized far more than a single family." The weight of that admission settled slowly over Elena as she began to understand exactly how significant her small, impulsive act of kindness had been. She had not simply saved an abandoned cub, she had saved the future of an entire hidden community, without ever knowing the stakes involved. "I didn't know any of this when I went into that ravine," she said quietly. "I just heard him crying, and I couldn't leave him there." "I understand that now," Kane said, and something in his voice had softened slightly from the cold authority of the night before. "It does not change the significance of what you did, but it does change how I understand your intentions." They sat in silence for a moment, the fire crackling softly, the cub's small contented sounds filling the space between them. Elena studied Kane's face, trying to reconcile the fierce, controlled leader sitting across from her with the desperate, exhausted man who had appeared at her door the night before, demanding answers with barely restrained fury. "What happens now?" she asked finally. "You said there were conditions." "There are," Kane said. "First, you must never speak of what you have learned tonight to anyone outside this cabin. Not to friends, not to family, not to anyone in the nearby town. The safety of my people depends entirely on remaining unknown to the wider human world, and any breach of that secrecy, however unintentional, could put us all at risk." Elena nodded slowly. "I can agree to that. Who would believe me anyway?" A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of Kane's mouth before disappearing again. "Second," he continued, "you will allow my scouts to observe your property periodically, to ensure my son's safety while he remains in your care. You will not be harmed or interfered with, but you should expect to occasionally sense their presence, particularly at night." "That explains the feeling of being watched," Elena murmured, half to herself. "Third," Kane said, and here his voice grew slightly more careful, "when he is strong enough to return, you will not resist his departure. He belongs with his pack, with his people, and however attached you may become to him in the meantime, that attachment cannot become an obstacle to his eventual return." The condition landed harder than Elena expected, a small, unexpected ache settling in her chest at the thought of eventually losing the small creature she had already grown so fond of in just over a week. But she understood the reasoning, understood that whatever bond she had formed with the cub could not outweigh his place among his own people. "I understand," she said quietly. "I never intended to keep him forever. I just wanted him to survive." Kane studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his pale eyes. "You have done more than that," he said finally. "You have cared for him as though he were your own, without any understanding of what he truly was, without any expectation of reward or recognition. That is not nothing, Elena Whitmore." It was the first time he had used her name, and hearing it in his low, measured voice sent an unexpected warmth through her chest that she quickly pushed aside, unwilling to examine it too closely. "Then we have an agreement," she said, extending her hand across the table in the human gesture she had grown up with, uncertain whether it meant anything within his world, but offering it regardless. Kane looked at her outstretched hand for a moment before reaching out and taking it, his grip firm but careful, as though he were still calculating exactly how much strength was appropriate to use around someone so much smaller and more fragile than himself. "We have an agreement," he confirmed. Neither of them could have known, in that quiet moment sealed over cooling tea and a fire crackling softly nearby, exactly how complicated that agreement would become in the weeks that followed, or how the careful boundaries they had just established would slowly begin to blur in ways neither of them had anticipated. The weeks that followed settled into an unexpected rhythm. Kane returned every few evenings, sometimes to check on his son's progress, sometimes simply to sit at Elena's small kitchen table and answer the endless stream of careful questions she had accumulated since their first conversation. She asked about his people's history, about how the shift between forms worked, about how many packs existed within the ridge, and how leadership had passed to him. He answered most of her questions honestly, surprising himself with how easily the words came, how little effort it took to speak plainly with her, compared to the careful diplomacy required with his own people. Elena, for her part, found herself looking forward to his visits more than she was willing to admit, even to herself. There was something steadying about his presence, despite the enormous power she now understood he carried. Something that made her small cabin feel less isolated, and more like the center of something important. Shadow grew rapidly during this time, his wobbly legs steadying into confident, playful bounds, his pale gold eyes growing sharper and more aware with each passing week. He had taken to following Elena around the cabin during the day and greeting Kane with unrestrained joy each evening, seemingly unbothered by the strange arrangement that kept him moving between two very different worlds. One evening, nearly a month after their first meeting, Kane arrived earlier than usual, catching Elena still finishing repairs on a section of fence that had come loose near her small barn. She startled slightly at his approach, not from fear but simple surprise, and something about the easy, unguarded way she greeted him told him clearly enough that whatever careful distance had existed between them at the beginning had eroded considerably. "You're early," she said, wiping dirt from her hands onto her jeans. "I finished my responsibilities sooner than expected," Kane said, watching her work with an expression she could not quite read. "Do you need help with that?" Elena glanced at the fence post, then back at him, raising an eyebrow slightly. "Do wolves know how to fix fences?" "This one does," Kane said, and there was something almost like humor in his voice, a lightness she had not heard from him before. They worked together in comfortable silence for nearly an hour, Kane's enormous strength making quick work of tasks that would have taken Elena the better part of an afternoon alone. She found herself sneaking glances at him as they worked, studying the careful, deliberate way he moved, so different from the controlled fury she remembered from their first meeting. Whatever fierce authority defined him among his own people, here, in her small, quiet corner of the world, he seemed almost relaxed. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally, as they finished securing the last post. "You have been asking me things for weeks," Kane said, a faint smile touching his mouth. "I doubt one more question will surprise me." "Why do you keep coming yourself?" Elena asked. "You're the leader of your entire people. Surely you have scouts, messengers, someone who could check on Shadow, without you needing to be here personally every few days." Kane was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer carefully. "At first," he said finally, "it was simply concern for my son. I did not trust anyone else's judgment enough to rely on second-hand reports." "And now?" Elena asked, though something in her chest tightened slightly at the question, uncertain what answer she was hoping for. Kane met her eyes directly, something serious and unguarded passing across his expression. "Now," he said slowly, "I find myself less concerned about my son's safety, and more curious about the woman who saved him without a single thought for her own." The words hung in the evening air between them, heavier than either of them had intended. Elena felt her breath catch slightly, unsure how to respond to an honesty she had not expected from someone who carried himself with such careful control in every other aspect of his life. "I only did what anyone should have done," she said finally, though her voice came out quieter than she intended. "No," Kane said firmly, "not anyone. Most humans in this region are taught from childhood to fear these woods, to avoid anything unusual they might encounter here. You climbed into a frozen ravine during a violent storm for a creature you had never seen before, with no guarantee of your own safety. That is not something anyone would do, Elena. That is something only you would do." She did not know how to respond to that, so she said nothing at all, simply holding his gaze for a long moment before looking away toward the darkening tree line, where Shadow had wandered off to chase something small and quick through the fallen leaves. Over the following weeks, their conversations grew easier, less careful, filled with small moments of shared laughter that neither of them had anticipated when this strange arrangement first began. Elena learned about the history of Wolfsbane Ridge, about the careful balance Kane's people maintained with the surrounding human towns, about the responsibilities that weighed on him every single day as leader of a community whose survival depended entirely on remaining hidden. Kane, in turn, learned about Elena's life before the cabin, about the career she had left behind in the city, about the quiet loneliness that had first driven her to this isolated corner of the world, and the strange, unexpected peace she had found here, despite that loneliness. He found himself drawn to her steady, unflinching honesty, so different from the careful diplomacy and political maneuvering that defined most of his interactions within his own world. Neither of them spoke openly about what was growing between them, though both were increasingly aware of it. It showed in the way Kane lingered longer than necessary during his evening visits, in the way Elena found herself watching for his approach through the trees each evening before he had even arrived, in the small, quiet moments of comfortable silence that had replaced the careful tension of their first meetings. It was Shadow, in his innocent, uncomplicated way, who seemed to understand the shift most clearly of all, greeting both of them together with equal enthusiasm each evening, as though he had already decided, in whatever simple logic guided a young cub's mind, that this arrangement of two people from entirely different worlds was exactly as it should be. But even as this fragile, unexpected connection deepened between them, neither Elena nor Kane could ignore the reality waiting just beyond the edges of their careful arrangement. Shadow was growing stronger every day, and with that strength came the inevitable approach of the day when their agreement would require him to return fully to his pack. Neither of them spoke of it directly, but the knowledge sat quietly between them during every visit, an unspoken deadline neither was quite ready to face. The accident happened on an otherwise ordinary afternoon, nearly 2 months after Elena had first pulled Shadow from the ravine. She was outside gathering firewood when she heard an unfamiliar sound from near the tree line, a sharp yelp followed by something that made her blood run cold, a sound too complex, too layered, to have come from any ordinary wolf cub. She dropped the firewood and ran toward the sound, her heart hammering with a fear she could not name, until she rounded the edge of her small barn and stopped dead in her tracks. There, tangled awkwardly in a patch of brush, was not the small dark cub she had grown so attached to, but a boy, no older than perhaps 6 or 7 in appearance, with the same striking pale gold eyes and dark hair, struggling to free himself from the branches that had caught his small human limbs. For a moment, Elena simply stood frozen, her mind refusing to process what her eyes were clearly showing her. The cub had shifted. Somehow, despite everything Kane had told her about young ones being too unstable to control the change safely, Shadow had shifted into a form she had never seen before, and he was now trapped and clearly frightened, unable to shift back on his own. She moved before her mind had fully caught up, kneeling beside him and carefully working the branches free from around his small arms and legs. He looked up at her with wide, frightened eyes she recognized instantly despite the unfamiliar human face surrounding them. "It's okay," she said softly, her voice steady, despite the shock still coursing through her. "I've got you, you're okay." Once he was free, the boy immediately pressed himself against her, small arms wrapping tightly around her neck, and Elena held him without hesitation, murmuring soft reassurances even as her mind raced through the implications of what she had just witnessed. She had known, intellectually, that Shadow would eventually be able to shift. Kane had explained it to her weeks ago, but knowing something in theory and witnessing it firsthand, holding the small, trembling human form of a creature she had only ever known as a wolf cub, was an entirely different experience altogether. She carried him back inside, wrapping him in a blanket by the fire, just as she had done the very first night she found him, and within a few minutes, his small body seemed to relax enough that the shift reversed itself, his human form dissolving back into the familiar dark-furred shape she knew so well. He curled against her exhausted, clearly worn out from whatever effort the unexpected shift had required, and fell asleep almost instantly. Elena sat with him for a long time afterward, her mind working through everything she now understood more completely than ever before. This was not simply an unusual animal she had rescued. This was a child, in every sense that mattered, capable of thought and feeling and fear in ways she had perhaps understood intellectually, but had never truly felt in her chest until this moment. When Kane arrived that evening, she met him at the door before he could even reach it, her expression serious enough that his own posture immediately shifted into alertness. "What happened?" he asked, his voice sharp with concern. "He shifted," Elena said. "On his own, this afternoon. He got tangled in some brush and couldn't change back. I found him and brought him inside, and he shifted back once he calmed down." Kane's expression went through several rapid changes, alarm giving way to something more complicated as he processed the information. "That should not be possible," he said, moving quickly past her into the cabin, checking on the sleeping cub by the fire with visible relief, before turning back to Elena. "Cubs his age rarely have that kind of control. It usually develops much later." "Is that dangerous?" Elena asked. "For him, I mean." "It can be," Kane admitted. "An uncontrolled shift can be disorienting, exhausting, sometimes even harmful if it happens somewhere unsafe. The fact that he managed it at all suggests he is developing faster than expected, which is not entirely surprising, given how quickly he has grown under your care." Something in the way he said it, quiet and thoughtful, made Elena look at him more carefully. "You're not upset that I saw him like that," she said slowly, realization dawning. "You're not worried about the secrecy." Kane met her eyes, and something vulnerable passed briefly across his usually controlled expression. "I have thought about this moment for weeks," he admitted, "about what would happen when you finally saw the full truth of what he is, of what I am. I worried it might frighten you, might change how you saw him, how you saw all of this." "It doesn't change anything," Elena said firmly. "If anything, it makes it more real. He's not just an animal I found in a ravine. He's a child, Kane. A real child, who trusts me, who needs protection just as much in this form as in the other." Something shifted in Kane's expression at her words, a tightness in his shoulders easing, that Elena had not even realized was there. "Most humans," he said quietly, "upon learning the full truth of what we are, react with fear, sometimes with revulsion. It has happened before, in the history of my people, and it has never ended well for anyone involved." "I'm not most humans," Elena said simply. "No," Kane agreed, his voice softer now than she had ever heard it. "You are not." They stood together for a long moment in the quiet cabin, the fire crackling softly, the sleeping cub curled peacefully between them, and something passed silently between them in that shared look, an understanding neither of them was quite ready to name aloud, but that both of them felt settling into place regardless. From that evening forward, the careful boundaries that had defined their arrangement began to blur more openly. Kane no longer simply visited to check on his son's progress. He stayed longer, spoke more freely, allowed Elena glimpses into parts of his life and his people that he had never intended to share with an outsider. And Elena, in turn, found herself trusting him completely, in a way she had not trusted anyone in years, drawn to the quiet strength and unexpected gentleness hidden beneath his fierce exterior. Neither of them could have known, as they stood together that evening, that their growing closeness had already been noticed by eyes far less friendly than their own, eyes belonging to a rival pack that had been watching Wolfsbane Ridge carefully for exactly this kind of opportunity, waiting for the first sign of weakness in an alpha king whose careful control had, for the first time in his long leadership, begun to slip. Victor had led the Blackthorn pack for nearly a decade, carving out a territory to the east of Wolfsbane Ridge through careful patience and calculated ambition, rather than the natural respect that Kane commanded so effortlessly. He had always resented the boundary lines that kept his pack confined to the poorer hunting grounds along the eastern slopes, always believed that his own strength and cunning deserved a larger share of the ridge than tradition had allotted him. For years, he had watched Kane's leadership from a careful distance, waiting for any sign of weakness that might justify a challenge to the established order. Kane's control had always been absolute, his judgment sound, his authority unquestioned, even by those packs who might have preferred different terms. There had never been an opening, never a crack in the careful discipline that made Kane such a formidable leader. Until now. Victor's own scouts had first brought him word of the strange arrangement weeks earlier, reports of the Alpha King visiting a human dwelling with unusual frequency, of his missing heir being cared for by a woman from the nearby town, rather than returned immediately to pack custody. At first, Victor had dismissed the reports as insignificant, assuming Kane's visits were simply the practical concerns of ensuring his son's safety. But as the weeks passed and the reports continued, painting a picture of visits that grew longer, more frequent, more personal in nature, Victor began to see an opportunity forming that he had waited a very long time for. An alpha distracted by affection for a human was an alpha who had made himself vulnerable, and vulnerability, in the world Victor understood, was simply an invitation. He called a private meeting with his most trusted advisors deep within Blackthorn territory, away from any risk of Kane's scouts overhearing their plans. Around a low fire in a hidden clearing, 4 wolves gathered in their human forms, their faces illuminated by flickering light, their expressions calculating and cold. "The Alpha King has grown careless," Victor said without preamble, his voice carrying the quiet authority he had spent years cultivating within his own pack. "He spends his evenings with a human woman, while his responsibilities to his own people go neglected. His judgment has been compromised by sentiment, and sentiment, as we all know, has no place in leadership." One of his advisors, a sharp-featured woman named Talia, who had served as his closest confidant for years, leaned forward with interest. "You believe this is an opportunity?" "I believe," Victor said carefully, "that a leader who cannot be trusted to prioritize his own people's safety over his personal attachments has already forfeited some measure of his right to lead them. The other packs respect Kane, because he has always placed duty above all else. If they begin to see him compromising that duty for the sake of a human woman, that respect will erode on its own, without any need for us to act directly." "And if it does not erode quickly enough on its own?" Talia asked. Victor's expression grew colder, more deliberate. "Then perhaps it requires a small push, something that forces the other packs to see clearly what Kane has allowed himself to become distracted by, something that demonstrates, beyond any doubt, that his priorities have shifted away from the safety and strength of his own people." The implication hung heavy in the air around the fire, understood by everyone present without needing to be spoken aloud more directly. Whatever Victor was planning, it would involve the human woman Kane had grown so attached to, and it would not be gentle. "The other packs still respect him deeply," another advisor cautioned. "Moving against him directly, even indirectly through this woman, carries significant risk if it is discovered. Which is precisely why we will be patient," Victor said. "We will watch, we will wait for the right moment, when his attention is most divided, when acting against this weakness will cause the maximum damage to his standing, with the least risk to ourselves. Patience has always served us well before. It will serve us again now." Over the following weeks, Victor's scouts increased their surveillance of both Kane's territory and Elena's isolated cabin, gathering careful details about patterns and habits, about the exact evenings Kane typically visited, about how long he usually stayed, about the layout of the property, and the distance to the nearest pack members, who might respond quickly if trouble arose. They noted, with growing interest, the day Shadow was seen shifting into his human form for the first time outside pack territory, an event that would normally have been cause for careful pack celebration and protection, but which here occurred entirely under human supervision, far from the safety of Kane's usual protective circle. They noted, too, the growing ease between Kane and Elena, the way his visits had shifted from cautious diplomatic necessity into something clearly more personal, more emotionally significant than either of them likely realized was visible to careful outside observation. Victor received these reports with quiet satisfaction, watching the pieces of his plan fall into place, with the patience of someone who had waited years for exactly this kind of opening. He did not move quickly. He did not act rashly. He simply waited, gathering information, calculating the precise moment when striking at Kane's growing attachment to the human woman would cause the maximum disruption to his authority, and standing among the other packs of Wolfsbane Ridge. Meanwhile, entirely unaware of the careful, calculating attention now focused on her small, isolated cabin, Elena continued her quiet life exactly as she had before, caring for Shadow, welcoming Kane's increasingly frequent visits, allowing herself, slowly and cautiously, to imagine a future that included this strange, powerful man who had walked so unexpectedly into her isolated world. She had no way of knowing that somewhere beyond the eastern border of Wolfsbane Ridge, a rival leader was already counting down the days until the perfect moment arrived to shatter that fragile happiness entirely, using her as the exact instrument of Kane's downfall that Victor had been searching for through years of careful, patient waiting. Ben Carter had lived near Wolfsbane Ridge his entire life, and like most people in the small town nearby, he had learned early on to respect the careful, unspoken boundaries that governed the forest at the edge of their community. His grandfather had warned him as a child never to go beyond the marked trails after dark, never to hunt too deep into certain sections of the woods, no matter how promising the tracks looked. And Ben had always followed those warnings without question, even without fully understanding the reasons behind them. He had known Elena for the entire 4 years she had lived at the edge of the ridge, occasionally helping her haul supplies when the roads grew difficult in winter, checking in on her during particularly bad storms to make sure she had not run into trouble living alone so close to the tree line. He considered her a friend, and it was that friendship that brought him to her cabin on a cold afternoon, carrying supplies she had ordered from town, only to find something that immediately set his instincts on edge. There were tracks near her property that he did not recognize, tracks too large and too numerous to belong to the ordinary wildlife he was accustomed to seeing in the area. They circled her cabin at a careful distance, avoiding the cleared yard directly around the structure, but clearly maintaining a persistent watch from the surrounding tree line. He mentioned it to Elena when she answered the door, watching her face carefully for any reaction that might explain the unusual pattern. "You seen anything strange out here lately?" he asked, setting the supplies down just inside her doorway. "There's tracks all around your property. Big ones. More than I've ever seen out this way before." Elena's expression flickered with something Ben could not quite identify, a careful hesitation that told him she knew more than she was willing to share. "Probably just wolves passing through," she said, her voice a little too casual for his liking. "It's been an unusually active winter for wildlife." Ben studied her a moment longer, unconvinced but unwilling to push further. He had known Elena long enough to recognize when she was being deliberately vague, and while it concerned him, he also trusted her judgment enough not to demand answers she clearly did not want to give. "Just be careful," he said finally. "Whatever's out there, it's not behaving like normal wolves. Normal wolves don't usually stick this close to a house for this long without doing something about it." "I'll be careful," Elena promised, and Ben left it at that, though the unease stayed with him long after he had driven back toward town. What Ben could not have known, standing on Elena's porch that afternoon, was that the tracks he had noticed did not belong to Kane's protective scouts, who had grown far more careful about concealing their presence in recent weeks, at Kane's explicit instruction. These were different tracks belonging to Victor's scouts, who had grown bold enough in their surveillance that they no longer bothered with quite the same level of caution their target's own people maintained. Elena had noticed the difference herself, though she had not mentioned it to Kane, uncertain at first whether it meant anything significant, or was simply her imagination working overtime, after months of living with the knowledge of a hidden world existing just beyond her windows. But over the following days, the sense of being watched grew sharper, more deliberate, less like the careful, distant observation Kane's scouts maintained, and more like something actively probing for weakness. She mentioned it to Kane during his next visit, watching his expression carefully as she described the unfamiliar pattern of tracks Ben had pointed out, the different quality of the watching presence she had begun to sense at night. Kane's reaction told her immediately that this was not simply her imagination. His entire posture shifted, tension coiling through his shoulders as he listened to her description with growing alarm. "Show me exactly where these tracks were," he said, and Elena led him outside despite the gathering evening darkness, pointing toward the section of tree line where Ben had noticed the unusual activity. Kane knelt beside the tracks, his expression darkening further as he examined them closely. "These are not my people," he said finally, his voice low and controlled, despite the obvious concern building beneath the surface. "This pattern, this territory marking, this belongs to Blackthorn." "Blackthorn?" Elena repeated, unfamiliar with the name. "A rival pack," Kane said, standing slowly, his eyes scanning the darkening tree line with renewed vigilance. "Led by a wolf named Victor, who has coveted greater territory within Wolfsbane Ridge, for longer than I care to remember. If his people are watching your property this closely, it means he has learned of my visits here, and he is looking for a way to use that knowledge against me." A cold, uneasy feeling settled into Elena's stomach at his words. "Against you how?" Kane's expression grew grim, his jaw tightening as he considered how much to share with her about the political complexities of his world. "Leadership among my people is not simply inherited," he said finally. "It must be maintained through strength, through the respect and confidence of the packs who follow. If Victor believes he can portray my attention here as a weakness, a distraction from my responsibilities, he may attempt to use that perception to challenge my authority. And if he does, Elena asked quietly, then it will likely not remain simply a matter of politics, Kane said, his voice quiet but deadly serious. Victor is not known for subtlety, once he believes an advantage has presented itself. If he sees you as a vulnerability he can exploit, he may act directly against you to prove his point, regardless of the danger that poses to an innocent human, unaware of the true stakes involved. Elena felt the weight of that warning settle heavily over her. The careful, quiet happiness she had built over the past months, suddenly shadowed by a danger she had never anticipated when she first pulled a shivering cub out of a frozen ravine. She had known, intellectually, that Kane's world carried risks she did not fully understand. She had not expected those risks to extend so directly toward her own safety, threatening not just herself, but potentially the fragile, unexpected happiness she had found with a man from a world entirely different from her own. "What do we do?" she asked finally, her voice steady, despite the fear building quietly beneath the surface. Kane looked at her for a long moment, something fierce and protective hardening behind his pale gold eyes. "We prepare," he said simply. "Because if Victor intends to move against you to weaken my standing, he will find that threatening you is the single fastest way to guarantee my full and undivided attention, in ways he will not enjoy." The attack came on a night when Kane was not there. Elena had grown accustomed, over the past several weeks, to a heightened awareness of her surroundings, following Kane's warning about Victor's rival pack with careful diligence. She kept her doors locked, avoided venturing far from the cabin after dark, and maintained close attention to any unusual sounds or movements near the tree line. But even careful preparation could not fully account for the speed and precision with which Victor's scouts finally made their move. It began with the sound of Shadow's frightened whimpering from near the edge of the property, where he had wandered to chase after a stick Elena had tossed for him earlier that evening. She ran toward the sound immediately, her heart already hammering with dread, before she rounded the corner of her barn and saw exactly what she had feared most since Kane's warning weeks earlier. 3 wolves, far larger and more menacing than any she had encountered before, had cornered Shadow against the barn wall, their postures low and predatory, their attention fixed entirely on the small cub who had grown too confident in the safety of his familiar surroundings to sense the danger approaching until it was already too late to escape. Elena did not think. She simply moved, placing herself directly between the cub and the advancing wolves, her arms spread wide, despite having absolutely nothing with which to defend herself against creatures easily capable of ending her life within seconds. "Get away from him," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, though her whole body trembled with adrenaline and fear. The largest of the 3 wolves paused, studying her with an intelligence that confirmed exactly what she already suspected, that these were not ordinary animals but Victor's people, sent specifically to demonstrate exactly the kind of vulnerability Kane had warned her about. The wolf's posture shifted, and within seconds it had transformed into its human form. A tall, sharp-featured man, whose cold expression left no doubt about his intentions. "Step aside," the man said, his voice carrying an authority that made it clear he was accustomed to being obeyed. "This does not need to become complicated. We simply need the cub." "He's not going anywhere with you," Elena said, refusing to move despite every instinct screaming at her to run. The man's expression shifted into something almost amused, though there was nothing warm in it. "Brave," he said, "or perhaps simply foolish. Either way, it changes nothing about the outcome here." He took a step forward, and Elena felt Shadow press tightly against the back of her legs, his small body trembling with a fear she recognized instantly, the same terror she had felt the very first night she found him abandoned in the ravine. Whatever fear gripped her own chest in that moment, it paled entirely beside her determination to protect him, just as she had protected him then. "I said get away," she repeated, her voice hardening, despite the very real danger standing only a few feet away from her. What happened next occurred faster than Elena could fully process. The man lunged forward, and Elena instinctively grabbed the nearest object within reach, a heavy piece of firewood stacked beside the barn, swinging it with every ounce of strength she possessed. It connected solidly enough to stagger him backward, buying her precious seconds she used to scoop Shadow into her arms and turn toward the cabin, running as fast as her legs would carry her despite knowing, even as she ran, that she could not possibly outpace creatures built for exactly this kind of pursuit. She did not make it far before a powerful hand closed around her arm, yanking her backward with enough force to send her stumbling to the ground, Shadow tumbling from her grip and scrambling desperately toward the safety of the tree line rather than back toward the danger surrounding his caretaker. Elena looked up from the ground at the man standing over her, his expression cold and calculating, and for the first time since this entire strange journey had begun, genuine terror gripped her chest at the realization that she might not survive this encounter. And then, from the darkness beyond the clearing, came a sound that made every wolf present freeze in place, a deep, resonant howl that carried a warning no creature within Wolfsbane Ridge could mistake for anything other than exactly what it was. Cain arrived like something out of a nightmare, belonging entirely to Victor's people, moving with a speed and ferocity that Elena had never witnessed from him before, his form shifting mid-stride from wolf to man, and back again, with a fluid, terrifying control that spoke to power far beyond what she had understood him to possess. Within seconds, the 3 scouts who had cornered her were retreating into the trees, clearly unprepared to face the full fury of an Alpha King who had just discovered his son and the woman he loved under direct threat. Cain reached Elena's side within moments, kneeling beside her with an expression torn between fierce protective anger and genuine terror at how close he had come to losing her. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his hands moving carefully over her arms, checking for injuries with an urgency that betrayed exactly how deeply his feelings for her had grown. "I'm okay," Elena managed, though her voice shook with the aftermath of adrenaline. "Shadow, is he?" "Safe," Cain said, glancing toward the tree line where the small cub had already returned, pressing anxiously against Elena's side the moment danger had passed. "You protected him. Again. Despite everything, despite the danger to yourself, you protected him." Elena looked up at Cain, seeing something in his expression she had not fully allowed herself to recognize before this moment, a depth of feeling that went far beyond simple gratitude or careful political alliance. Whatever had grown between them over these past months, it had just been tested in the most brutal way possible, and it had not broken. "I couldn't let them take him," she said simply. "Not after everything." Cain pulled her carefully into his arms, holding her against his chest, with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the fierce power she had just witnessed him unleash against Victor's scouts. "You risked your life for him," he murmured against her hair. "Twice now. I do not know how to properly express what that means to me, Elena." For a long moment, they simply held each other in the aftermath of danger, Shadow curled contentedly between them, and somewhere beyond the tree line, Victor's retreating scouts carried word back to their leader that whatever weakness he had hoped to exploit in Cain's leadership had just been answered with a display of protective fury that would leave no doubt among any pack within Wolfsbane Ridge about exactly how far their Alpha King was prepared to go for those he considered his own. News of the attack spread quickly through Wolfsbane Ridge, carried by scouts and pack members who had witnessed, in various forms, the terrifying display of Cain's fury when he discovered his son and the human woman he had grown so attached to under direct threat from Blackthorn's people. What Victor had intended as a demonstration of Cain's weakness had instead become, within days, a demonstration of exactly the opposite, a display of loyalty and protective strength that resonated deeply with pack members who valued exactly those qualities in their leadership. Dorian was the one who brought Cain the full report of how the incident had been received among the other packs, finding him at Elena's cabin the following morning, where Cain had remained through the night, unwilling to leave her side after everything that had happened. "The other packs are speaking of it," Dorian said carefully, glancing between Cain and Elena, who sat close together near the fire, Shadow curled contentedly in her lap. "Word has spread of how quickly and fiercely you responded to the threat against your son and the woman under your protection. Rather than seeing weakness in your attachment to her, many are speaking of loyalty, of exactly the kind of leader they wish to follow." Cain's expression remained carefully neutral, though Elena noticed the slight easing of tension in his shoulders at the news. "And Victor?" he asked. "Retreating to his own territory," Dorian confirmed. "His scouts returned with nothing but injuries and a clear demonstration of your capabilities. I do not believe he will attempt something so direct again. not after seeing exactly how decisively you responded. He may try something less direct, Kane said grimly. Victor does not give up easily on ambitions he has held for years. Perhaps not, Dorian agreed. But for now, at least, this immediate threat has passed, and your standing among the packs has, if anything, grown stronger rather than weaker. After Dorian left, Kane remained quiet for a long time, staring into the fire, while Elena watched him carefully, sensing that something significant was working through his mind. Finally, he turned to her, his expression more open and vulnerable than she had ever seen it. I have led my people for many years, he said slowly, always believing that duty required a certain distance from personal attachment, that allowing myself to care too deeply for anything beyond my responsibilities would make me vulnerable in exactly the way Victor hoped to exploit. And now? Elena asked quietly, though something in his tone told her the answer before he spoke it. Now I understand that I was wrong, Kane said. What happened last night did not weaken me. It showed the other packs exactly the kind of loyalty and strength that comes from caring deeply for those under my protection, human or otherwise. You did not make me vulnerable, Elena. You made me understand what I was truly fighting to protect all along. Elena felt tears gathering unexpectedly in her eyes at his words, months of careful uncertainty finally giving way to something clearer and more solid between them. What does that mean? She asked softly. For us? Kane reached across the small space between them, taking her hand in his, with a gentleness that contrasted so sharply with the fierce power she had witnessed the night before. It means, he said, that I no longer wish to hide what has grown between us, not from my people, not from anyone. You have proven yourself, twice now, willing to risk everything for my son, for this family, that has somehow, against every expectation I carried into this, become as much yours as it is mine. Over the following weeks, Kane formally introduced Elena to his pack, an event that would have been unimaginable months earlier, when a human dwelling near the ravine was simply an unremarkable detail of the landscape. The pack, having already heard of her courage during the attack, welcomed her with a warmth that surprised even Kane, recognizing in her the same steady, unflinching loyalty that had drawn their Alpha King to her in the first place. Shadow, now old enough to shift between forms with growing confidence, split his time between his father's pack and Elena's cabin. The boundary between the two worlds that had once felt so impossibly separate now blurred into something that worked comfortably for everyone involved. He had, in his simple, uncomplicated way, brought together two people from entirely different worlds who might never have found each other otherwise, and he seemed to understand, in whatever way a young cub understands such things, exactly how significant that gift truly was. Victor did not trouble them again, at least not directly, though Kane remained watchful, understanding that ambition rarely disappeared entirely, only shifted into more patient forms waiting for future opportunities. But for now, standing at the boundary between his territory and the quiet cabin that had become as much a part of his life as the ancient forest he had protected for so many years, Kane felt a peace he had not known was possible. Elena stood beside him one evening, months after that first desperate night in the storm, watching Shadow bound happily between his two forms across the clearing, and she thought back to the moment she had first heard his frightened cry carried on the wind, never imagining that single act of instinctive kindness would lead her to exactly this moment, standing beside a man whose entire world had once seemed impossibly separate from her own. I never planned any of this, she said softly, leaning into Kane's side as his arm settled protectively around her shoulders. Neither did I, Kane admitted, his voice carrying a warmth that had become as familiar to her now as her own heartbeat. But I have found, over these past months, that the things we never planned for are sometimes the very things we needed most. Below them, Shadow let out a happy, playful bark, chasing his own shadow across the snow-covered clearing, entirely unaware of how close he had come, months earlier, to never experiencing any of this at all. He knew only that he was loved, protected fiercely by two people from entirely different worlds, who had somehow found their way to each other because of him, and that, in the end, was exactly as it should be. The Alpha King and the woman who had once risked everything for a tiny, freezing cub stood together at the edge of Wolfsbane Ridge as the sun set behind the ancient trees, their story no longer one of separate worlds forced into uneasy alliance, but one of a family built from courage, loyalty, and a kindness that had asked for nothing in return. and had somehow, against every expectation, received everything.